Welcome back to Anomalous Materials, a series analyzing every aspect that makes Half-Life the amazing, enduring game that it is. Today, we're going to be going over the first chapter of the game involving combat, and discussing the combat itself once we get there. So, now that everything's gone horribly wrong, Gordon wakes up in the destroyed test chamber, beginning unforeseen consequences. This chapter is one of my personal favorites, as it takes Gordon back through the Anomalous Materials laboratory and introduces many of the enemies and weapons used throughout the duration of the game. I'll be covering all of them in detail when we get to them, and thankfully that doesn't take very long in this chapter. So, after a few moments to allow the player to get used to this new reality, Gordon makes his way back up the elevator. Here, we get to see the game's use of realistic emotion with his characters, a rather rare sight in games at the time, in a quick conversation between two scientists seen in the previous chapter.
Why didn't they listen? We tried to warn them. I never thought I'd see a resonance cascade, let alone create one.
It's here that we get a quick glimpse at the first enemy of the game, threateningly attempting to lunge toward Gordon, in one of the first examples of Half-Life's invisible tutorial. This immediately teaches the player that this creature is not friendly, and that it will attack by leaping, without a single piece of dialogue or a break in the action. Half-Life gives the player a moment to observe nearly every enemy like this, safely getting to know the basics of their behavior before actually fighting them. So one of these two scientists opens up the door for Gordon, and I wouldn't really mention that if not for the fact that this particular scientist has actually been retconned to be Eli Vance, one of the major characters in Half-Life 2. There's a quick, small set piece where the control room from earlier is destroyed by what remains of the anti-mass spectrometer, before the player reaches their first true encounter with the head crab. Now, before I go over the creature itself, this is a good time to mention that I'm playing the game on the medium difficulty. This means that the stats for the enemies will be quite a bit lower than on hard. A lot of the anecdotes and easy methods I lay out for dispatching the various creatures will be given with the medium difficulty in mind, but a decent amount of them apply to hard as well. Anyway, without further ado, this is the head crab. The head crab is a very simple, humble creature, somewhere around 2 feet long, quite smooth, and equipped with 4 legs, 2 long ones in the front and 2 short, stubby appendages in the back. On the underside, the creature appears to have some sort of horrible, nightmare-inducing mess of teeth, or needles, or something. Their vocalizations are made up of squeaks and high-pitched squeals when attacking their prey, which they do by leaping great distances for a bite. In combat scenarios, they're often encountered in groups, with at least 2 or 3 of them in the same place at any time. They can also be found quite frequently stalking various air vents through the facility, providing a scare for newer players. In the alpha version of the game, headcrabs are much larger and almost entirely shades of bright red and orange. They act pretty much the same as the released game, although they do seem to leap far more frequently. In the final game, the creatures can be easily dispatched with 2 smacks with the crowbar or 2 shots from the pistol, both found in this chapter. Any other weapon will work as well, but well, it's a bit of a waste, honestly. At first, this creature may be mistaken for the standard tiny and annoying type of enemy, as seen in games like Duke Nukem years before, but there's one aspect which makes this creature incredibly unique. We'll get to that shortly. So, completely avoiding the alien, Gordon makes his way to everyone's favorite room in the facility, Laser Limbo, before acquiring the first weapon in the game.
Weapon acquired.
Another contender for the most iconic element of this franchise, the crowbar is the only melee weapon used in the Half-Life series, and for good reason. This thing never stops being useful. It has a high rate of fire, which compensates for its relatively low damage output, and it's incredibly satisfying to just swing around and smash against the wall. As mentioned earlier, headcrabs can be taken out quite easily using it, as can a few of the other enemies we'll be covering in this episode. It's also the best tool for destroying glass, planks of wood, crates, and vent covers. The use of a crowbar sets Gordon apart from other FPS heroes at the time. Doomguy uses his fist and a big badass chainsaw, Duke Nukem kicks, but Gordon uses this ordinary tool as a weapon because he's forced to in order to survive. It's not ideal, but it works, and that's what matters. The crowbar returns in every direct sequel, as well as in all of the spin-offs aside from Opposing Force, where the crowbar is replaced with 2 other melee weapons. It's the quintessential weapon of the franchise, and its use has been referenced by a number of other games since. Now that Gordon has acquired his signature weapon, he can break through the door and find an example of Half-Life's dark comedy on the other side. The game is filled with little moments like this, and I'll be sure to include a lot of them throughout the series. So Gordon's forced to climb up the elevator shaft to reach the second encounter with a new enemy. The headcrab zombie is one of the scarier aspects of the series, and the concept never gets any less creepy as the games go on. Zombies in Half-Life used to be ordinary people. In the case of Half-Life 1, they all wear the standard outfit of a scientist, before their brains were overtaken entirely by a headcrab. The transformation's beginnings are shown in the series multiple times, but we never get to see exactly how a person becomes a horrific monster like this. Once fully transformed, the host has been completely mutilated. Their hands have become long, sharp claws used by the zombie to attack friendly NPCs. Their chest has been torn open, and what appears to be a mouth of sorts has formed. Throughout the game, zombies can be seen scooping pieces out of their prey and stuffing it into those mouths. This appears to be the easiest way for the zombie to eat, seeing as the actual mouth has been covered up. In Half-Life 1 only, the skull appears to be visible through the headcrab, making for a very disturbing sight. The host bodies have been entirely overtaken by the headcrabs, and now serve as mere tools for the parasites to thrive. Half-Life 2 actually hints at the human host's continued survival through the use of disturbing sound effects, but in the first game they simply make, well, these noises. Headcrabs and headcrab zombies are greatly expanded in the spin-offs and sequels, where various other forms and evolutions of the creatures appear. In Half-Life 1, due to their slow movement and use of melee attacks only, they can be taken out with pretty much any weapon. If Gordon helps this security guard take down the monster, he can actually accompany him for a few more rooms. If Gordon allows the guard to die, or kills him outright, then he'll gain the second weapon in the game early.
9mm semi-automatic handgun acquired.
Serving as the game's first firearm, Half-Life's pistol is based on the real-world Glock 17. It shares ammunition with another weapon found later in the game, and like the crowbar, it's useful all the way to the end. Its usefulness comes from its accuracy and how much ammo it can hold, 17 shots in the clip and up to 250 in reserve. This thing can serve as a great sniping weapon throughout the game, taking out enemies from surprising distances without putting Gordon in danger. This is going to become a running theme. There isn't a single weapon in the game that isn't useful up until the end. The pistol also has an alternative fire mode, shooting at a higher speed with much lower accuracy, which comes in handy in earlier sections of the game. For the duration of this chapter, the pistol is going to be Gordon's main method for dealing with the threats he'll encounter. In the files for the game, there exists a model for the Glock with a silencer attached, although this mechanic wasn't used in the final game. It seems that the silencer would have been acquired by killing an enemy found later on who uses silenced pistols, though the feature was ultimately scrapped. Oh, I'd also like to mention that this technically isn't the first opportunity to pick up the pistol. If you pull the cart back out of the anti-mass spectrometer as far as it can go in the first chapter, another alien will get stuck on it and carry over into the beginning of Unforeseen Consequences. Then there's this security guard who's being revived on the floor just outside. If you wait long enough, he'll get back up. Bring him into the room just before the test chamber, and use the alien to get him killed. It's actually really hard to pull this off consistently, but I managed to get it to work for this video. So now that Gordon's acquired his first firearm, he heads back up through the facility. Making a detour to the locker room gets him some extra bullets and a bit of power for the suit, one of the game's first optional paths leading to a reward. The game encourages exploration like this quite a lot, and the sequels only make this more valuable. There's another secret like this in the lobby. The player can break the control for the blast door to head outside for another fun scene and some more ammo. Afterward, Gordon progresses onward and to a few more scenes like this, both of which emphasize Half-Life's use of horror. The first displays the beginnings of a zombie, while the other, well, I'll just show you. Next up, we get a more formal introduction to the pistol for players who kept the security guard alive before finally reaching a new area entirely, the Sector B Coolant Reserve. And immediately, the player will encounter the third enemy of the game here. The Hound Eye is going to be fairly common throughout Half-Life. It's a large creature, around the size of a big dog. It has 3 legs, 1 massive compound eye, a small, strange-looking mouth on its underside, and a number of blue ridges or openings on its back. They make a variety of horrible, high-pitched sounds, especially when attacking the player, which they do by emitting some kind of shockwave. Commonly, the Hound Eye will run up to the player before retreating. They seem to run away an awful lot actually, far more than any other enemy in the game. They actually have a very complex system for AI involving packs and leaders and variations variations on damage depending on how many other hound eyes are in the area. Check the card above for a video by Murphy Black that goes into more depth on this. They can be taken out quite easily with the pistol or even the crowbar in lower numbers. I'd like to note here that the hound eye was to appear in Half-Life 2, now thin and malnourished. We have a few pieces of concept art and a texture, but no working model. Immediately after the first encounter with the hound eye, the player can get another look at G-Man on the catwalk above. Following him up there and escorting a scientist to a locked door will reward them with more ammo and another weapon, the hand grenade.
Fragmentation grenade acquired.
These things are, well, essentially just the standard FPS grenade. Based on the Mark II grenade used by the US Armed Forces, they're primarily used to flush out or blow up enemies, dealing a very substantial amount of damage in a decent-sized radius. Grenades can be cooked by holding down the fire button, allowing the player to time them to explode more quickly or even in the air. And right after getting the grenades, the player will go on to meet another new enemy, busting down the door. Now, in the interest of keeping this video from being nothing but bios and weapon descriptions, I'm going to hold off on explaining this one. For now, just blow it up. There's a bit of comedy here, where a scientist has found a rather unusual hiding spot, and a short section where the player almost drowned themselves to progress. And after that, we get to one of the game's more iconic set pieces, the lift. It's quite well known that the elevator is taken straight from Akira, and the section serves as a bit of a gauntlet where the player defends themselves from headcrabs raining from above. Next up, there's a bit of an issue with the catwalk. So the player gets to experience the first short platforming segment of the game. These are used quite sparingly throughout the campaign, and they never become tired or overdone until, well, we'll get there. For now, platforming is just a good way to keep the gameplay varied and interesting. This leads to another broken catwalk, which will also become a running theme, where the player gets a glimpse of another new enemy. One of the largest common enemies in the game, the bull squid is a rather formidable foe. In this first appearance, it can be seen aggressively killing a few headcrabs, running toward them at high speed and either biting them or smashing them with its tail. It'll then turn and begin to spit some sort of substance at the player, likely toxic, as they're often seen around toxic waste throughout the game. These lumbering beasts aren't easily taken down with the weapons Gordon currently has at his disposal, but with the distance between the player and the creature right now, it's not much of an issue. The sounds the beast makes are some of the most animalistic in the game, with growls, strange guttural noises, and pained moans. The bull squid's appearance is quite unusual, one of my favorite designs in the game. It only has 2 legs, which doesn't seem to slow it down any, and a good collection of bright red tentacles covering a mouth. When it eats, the tentacles move, likely helping it to scoop food toward the mouth in place of arms. Apparently, Gabe Newell told artist Ted Backman that he wanted to do a game something like Stephen King's The Mist. Ted read the book and it had some tentacle monsters in it, so he decided to go from there. It's also interesting to note that back when Half-Life went under the codename Quiver, artist Chuck Jones designed a similar creature called the land squid. At some point in development, the bull squid was known as the bull chicken instead, a name that carries over to its files and release. In early versions of the game, it takes on a very bright yellow color rather than the more realistic, flesh-like tone it takes on in release. Like the hound eyes, the bull squid was also going to appear in the sequel, and we have textures, models, and playable maps featuring them to prove it. They were cut pretty late into development due to the open nature of the level design, which made them much easier to dispatch than in the original. Now, looking up to the ceiling of the canal here, we see another enemy. I'm going to save this one for the next episode as well, because their behavior is displayed very well in the next chapter. Half-Life's enemies are introduced rather quickly, so there will be a lot less of these sections as the series goes on. With no other choice, the player will have to plunge down into the canal and swim through to the other end, leading to a more substantial platforming section. This room is rather confusing. There really doesn't seem to be any point in suspending these boxes above a pit like this, but it doesn't really matter. And that pretty much caps off the chapter. Gordon steps into the elevator, entering the first map of Chapter 4. Tune in next time for that. It's one of the best in the game, and as always, I'm open to any and all suggestions to improve this series. Thanks again for giving this a look. I'll see you in the next episode.